How They Find Out by Lilac Sky 128. Chapter 2. Percival. Percival was quiet. This, apart from his impressive size and strength, was one of the first things people noticed about him. As such, he found that people were inclined to think he was also fairly dim, and they made the mistake of thinking that because he didn't blurt out his opinions, that he had none of interest. This didn't particularly bother him, as he had learned early on that generally the people who were worth knowing were those that didn't make assumptions. Lancelot was one of these people. He had met him whilst traveling, trying to find his way in the world, as cliché as it now sounded. Lancelot had been similar, and he'd spied somewhat of a kindred spirit in the man who was so much like himself, trying to break free of his roots and become an honorable fighter, fighting for what was right. And this was the thing. Ever since he was a small boy, Percival had had a strong idea of what was right and of what was wrong, and when he believed in something, it didn't matter the cost. He would fight for it. And so, when Lancelot received word, from a man named Merlin, apparently, that the land of Camelot was under the control of an evil sorceress, there was no doubt in Percival's mind of what he would do. Lancelot told him that he was quite free to go his own way, but Percival didn't hesitate, as he told him that he would go with him. He would make a good king's enemies his enemies, and he would fight for what was right. It was, after all, who he was. He did not expect to meet a king who talked of equality. He certainly didn't expect to become a knight of the most prestigious order, and he didn't expect that he would actually find a home there. But Percival should have known better than to assume. It was in his nature to be quiet, and, although he was a fierce fighter, he possessed a surprising gentleness. He was also light-footed, and these qualities combined led him to often observing things he perhaps shouldn't. It happened that one day, as he was walking down a corridor, that he overheard part of a conversation between Gawain and Lancelot. "I know, you know," Gawain was saying, although Lancelot was looking fairly purposely perplexed. "And I have no idea what you're talking about." "Do you do? And I want to ask questions. And Merlin says he's told me everything, but I'm sure he hasn't. And Gawain, have you ever heard of the right a person has to privacy?" "No, of course you haven't. Look, if Merlin wants to tell you whatever it is, then I'm sure he will." "But that's the point. He doesn't want to tell me." "Then I don't think I'd be able to breach a confidence. Besides, I know as much as you. Less probably if Merlin's account of you talking his ear off about it is true. Plus, getting him paralytic in the process." "Not my fault if he can't hold his ale." "Well, I'm sure you got everything out of him then." "I didn't. And anyway, you must know more than me." Gawain then mumbled something, and Percival heard the words, "Don't see why," and "told you before me." Lancelot sighed. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about." As he saw Gawain begin to protest, he held up his hand. "But if I did, I'd tell you that he didn't tell me anyway." And with that, Lancelot left, leaving a disgruntled Gawain in his wake. Percival had paused to listen to the conversation, although he knew he shouldn't, and so resumed his steady gait, telling himself that it was really none of his business. He wasn't by nature an especially curious person. However, recently he had been awakened to the fact that he had never really cared about people enough to be curious about them before. However, since arriving in Camelot, he had found himself drawn to the odd group of knights, and others as well. He was a good judge of character, and he was immediately intrigued by the joking Gawain, who hid within him a fierce loyalty, and he felt he could claim to know Lancelot fairly well, who he knew was incredibly moral and ambitious. He also knew that they were pretty much polar opposites. What particularly intrigued him was the mention of Merlin. The man who had, in essence, been the catalyst in bringing him to Camelot was quite the odd person, although this was by no means an insult to him. He was a servant, but he was trusted and cared for so much by everyone that it seemed not to matter, which interested Percival, but he could certainly see why. There was just something about Merlin that instantly endeared him to people. He was so open and friendly, and in some ways very confident in himself. He also had no problem with attempting to take Arthur down a peg or two, which was an astounding thing for a servant, and what was more astounding was that Arthur was, well, if not unbothered by it, then certainly not sending Merlin to be executed. Past that, Percival liked Merlin. He was very different from himself, talking at a mile a minute and a lot, and tripping over everything left, right, and center, but he had a kindness to him that meant he noticed everyone and was always friendly. However, Percival had also got the feeling that for all Merlin's openness, there might just be something underneath, and what he had just heard seemed just to confirm this. When he next saw Merlin, it was at the training grounds. He was sitting at the side, assumedly waiting for Arthur to need something, although if one hadn't known better, looking at him, you might have thought he was sleeping. In fact, no, wait. He was sleeping. Or at least he had been until Arthur hit him over the head. Merlin jerked upright, managing to knock over the armor that was next to him, and ended up flat on his back, staring up at Arthur's face that loomed over him. "Are we boring you, Merlin?" he asked, his voice laden with sarcasm. "Well, yes, actually." Gawain let out a snort as he leaned on his sword, and Percival allowed a small smile to come over his face. Arthur looked round to glare at Gawain, who looked thoroughly unapologetic. "Well, I mean, even I'm bold, and I'm actually fighting. Although, then again," he tilted his head to one side, "I am fighting you, and we know you don't really present much of a challenge." "Why you? Not this again," Merlin muttered as Arthur advanced towards Gawain and engaged him in a sword fight, which neither of them were to ever win. Elliot hurried in late and took in the scene with a certain amount of interest before asking Merlin casually, "What's going on?" "Training has been postponed whilst Gawain and Arthur fight over whose ego is biggest." Ah, he looked at Percival, who had wandered over to them. "I needn't have bothered hurrying to get here then." "Well, will you?" asked Lancelot as he came over, evidently having grown bored of Gawain and Arthur's fight, which had in any case moved halfway up the field. "Oh, at the forge. There's been a lot of work on with the upcoming tournament." "Not another one?" Merlin asked. Tournaments nearly always meant at least one person trying to kill Arthur, and generally several other life-threatening injuries to those who took part. Elliot grimaced. He was still new to being a knight, and as he was also the town blacksmith, he was not precisely enchanted with the idea of tournaments either. But Arthur had been insistent that life must carry on in Camelot, and they must be seen as to be resuming normality after Morgana had taken over and driven their king slightly mad. Or a lot mad, actually. And even Merlin had conceded this point. "But," he had said, "I don't see why that has to mean a tournament." Some of the knights were enthusiastic. Gawain thought it would be a good opportunity to annoy some nobles, and Lancelot was quite excited, although it didn't show it very well, as he had grown up with tales of great heroes of tournaments standing proud at the end. Percival was not unenthusiastic, however, he also knew that this tournament held greater importance than Arthur was letting on. It was to shore normality returned to Camelot, of course it was, but Percival had seen the looks he and the other knights got. He knew that this tournament was also about proving to the nobles that Arthur had been right to knight commoners. This snobbery did not particularly bother him, however. He knew that it was important to Arthur that the nobles have faith in him. Since he had started ruling as Prince Regent, he had tried to show that he was as capable, and in Percival's private opinion, he was more so, as Uther to rule. But although the people had embraced him as their new leader, there were those who clung to the old ways and felt the prince was too young and inexperienced, and, quite possibly, too radical to take the throne. "There are some practice fights going on around town, apparently," said Elgin. "People are getting really weird about them, after all. Do they really need their swords right now?" It'll be over soon. Then all you have to do is fight in the tournament," Merlin said cheerily. "And not get killed," he added as an afterthought. "Honestly," said Elgin wearily, "I think that'll be the easiest part. I mean," he was cut off by the sudden arrival of an irate-looking man in full armor brandishing his sword at him. "Can't we help you?" Lancelot asked, who was, among many things, incurably polite. "You!" the man said, pointing the sword directly at Elliot. Percival moved to stand closer. He had found that his appearance could put many off from starting a fight. However, this man was not to be deterred. "You!" he repeated. Elliot's eyes were fixed on the sword that was swinging dangerously close to his forehead. "Hey," started Merlin, "don't you think you should—" "Do you know what just happened to me?" the man continued, oblivious to any protestations. Percival thought he might recognize him as one of the lords. He'd been at the dinner that had been thrown the other week. Elliot just shook his head.
I just lost, in a fight, to Lord Aldrin.
Oh, well, I'm sorry to hear that.
I'm not interested in your apologies. I was fighting with your sword, and I lost. I've never lost before, and I want to know why.
Merlin had caught on. Oh, come on, you can't seriously blame Elyon because you lost a fight. The irate lord swung his sword around so that it was level with Merlin's head. Lancelot's hand immediately went to the hilt of his sword, and Percival tensed himself in case a fight was necessary. Merlin said, as he realized what he'd just said, for that was not his strong point.
That,
the man spat, causing Merlin to flinch,
is exactly what I'm saying. Incapable, that's what he is. And as for you lot...
He swung his sword round again, and Percival thought that for someone who was so annoyed about the sword, he certainly seemed to have no trouble using it.
To think that this is what Camelot has to contend with as our...
He sneered.
Defenders.
Percival glanced up the field and saw that Gawain and Arthur were still fighting, which was lucky. The last thing Arthur needed was to quarrel with one of the people he needed on his side. However, Percival also knew that they couldn't outwardly oppose the Lord, who he was sure had a name, but somehow it didn't feel the right time to ask.
Look at you, nowhere near noble, and altogether unworthy of the titles you bear. And you, he gestured to Elyon, can't even manage a forge.
There is nothing, Elyon said through gritted teeth, wrong with that sword.
And I tell you there is. Look,
he said in a deceptively reasonable tone.
I've got no problem with the lower classes.
Merlin raised his eyebrows as the knights stood in stoic silence. Lord Ratchin, Percival suddenly remembered. That was it.
As long as they keep to their place. And you lot, fighters, please, I'm surprised you could put one foot in front of the other.
Lancelot bore this without showing any expression at all. Elyon looked nervous and a little worried, but Merlin, Percival could see, was growing steadily more and more angry on behalf of his friends.
And I'll be demanding full refund,
he finished before turning round and stalking off. Elyon sighed and turned away, rubbing his forehead. He turned back just in time to see Lord Ratchet seemingly trip over his own feet and go flying. And he couldn't help it. He started to laugh, quickly joined by Lancelot. Percival would have laughed too, only his eyes were fixed on Merlin. Percival had found that if you were quiet and steady as he was, people often forgot you were there, and it seemed that Merlin was not immune to this. At least, Percival could only assume that was why he had not hidden it very well from him when he had put a hand to his mouth and muttered some indecipherable words as his eyes glowed a burning gold. This had coincidentally coincided with Ratchet falling over his own feet, when anyone who had watched him fight had seen that he barely ever even stumbled. Only Percival didn't really believe in coincidence. And now it all made sense. Lancelot and Gawain's conversation, that thing that Merlin had been hiding. Magic. He was the thing. Percival had grown up in a small village where magic was, in fact, allowed. Hardly anyone he knew had it, but he had no prejudice against it. When he had learned of Camelot's strict stance, he had been surprised, although it wasn't incomprehensible given how many magical threats they had to contend with. However, he hadn't been completely swayed by their arguments against it. And he surmised Lancelot and Gawain clearly trusted him despite the magic, and he trusted their judgment. As well as trusting Merlin, of course. And so that was how Percival took all of 10 seconds to decide that this really wasn't a problem. Merlin, however, had glanced back, about to join in the laughter when he saw Percival staring at him. The smile died on his face as he saw his expression, and his eyes widened in fear. But Percival looked over to where Lord Ratchet was dusting himself off. Percival didn't think they'd be having any trouble from him for a while, and he couldn't help it. He laughed. As they were coming in from practice with Gawain and Arthur at the forefront. So I believe we can conclude that I am indeed the better fighter, Gawain announced loudly.
You cheated,
said Arthur, sounding much like a sulky child. Gawain stifled a laugh. Now, Arthur, if you're not going to be a good sportsman about it.
We called it a truce and then you caught me from behind. How is that not cheating?
Arthur, said Gawain slowly, as though he were speaking to a 5-year-old, you have to be ready for your enemies to try it underhanded tactics.
But you, as a knight of Camelot, should not be employing them.
Oh, so knights are meant to be honorable and lose, are they? Well, that seems fairly pointless.
No, that's not.
It was then that Merlin tapped Percival slightly nervously on the shoulder.
he said. Look, about what you saw. I swear I only ever... I know, said Percival, cutting him short. You do?
Percival smiled, a rare, warm, and gentle smile.
I like you, Merlin, he said, and I trust you. If it's all right with you, it's all right with me.
His smile turned slightly wry.
And I can promise you I'll keep quiet.
Merlin gave a grin of amusement, and as Percival moved off, he knew somehow that he could trust Sir Percival not to say anything.